Russian President Vladimir Putin says Moscow is ready for peace negotiations with Ukraine. The conflict has been going on now for longer than World War I and has claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides, in addition to substantial civilian casualties. To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guest. Marcus Papadopoulos is a historian, analyst and author specializing in Russia and the former Soviet Union. Marcus, great to have you with us.
Thank you ever so much for having me on.
At this stage in the conflict, and as I said, it's now lasted more than 4 years, what is your sense of there being a peace agreement soon? We just had this meeting, the G7 meeting in France. President Trump held a closed-door meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky, and he came out of that meeting saying it's time for Russia to make the deal. Is this a change from Trump's previous position? Where do you think this is heading?
I believe that the prospect of ending the war in Ukraine by peaceful means is most unrealistic. As I have said from day one of the Russian military campaign in Ukraine, now that the Russian army is there, the Kremlin will ensure that its objectives are achieved. And I have also said that either all or more than likely most of Ukraine will be captured by the Russians. Why? Because Ukraine is of immense importance to Russian national security. Let's just say, hypothetically speaking, that the Kremlin signed a peace agreement with Ukraine and NATO puts into writing that Ukraine will not be admitted as a member to the Western military bloc. How much significance can be attached to the words of NATO leaders? Because in the Kremlin's opinion, in a few years' time, NATO could simply say, well, the circumstances have changed, and therefore it is absolutely vital for Ukraine and for the independence and sovereignty and security of Europe for Ukraine to be a member of NATO. And then Russia would be in very serious trouble. So I reiterate, the Russian army will continue to advance, albeit slowly.
So what is the alternative to this kind of Russian skepticism that you are talking about? I mean, if there is a written agreement, it would be legally binding, but if Russia doesn't believe that the other side is going to observe that agreement, what's the alternative?
Well, NATO, as indeed Russia, can break any agreement. And what will happen to them? If NATO was to break an agreement with Russia, as it has already done. So, for example, in 1997, NATO and Russia signed an agreement with each other, which was supposed to ensure peace and security in Europe. And as part of that, NATO pledged that it would not deploy NATO forces on the Russian border. Well, of course, NATO violated that. Let us not forget, America withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia. So a country can violate an agreement and nothing will happen to it. Russia could violate an agreement and of course Western mainstream media would have a field of a day. But the brutal reality is that NATO has been proven to be a liar. They say one thing and do the other. And we cannot talk about Ukraine fighting against Russia. No, it is NATO using Ukraine as a proxy to fight against the Russian Federation.
It also seems that there is a lack of clarity on previous discussions. You'll remember those discussions that took place in Alaska between President Putin and President Trump. There was no agreement that came out of that, nothing written. There was some principles that were adopted at that meeting. And one of those principles, as far as the Russians are concerned, was that Ukraine would get out of the Donbass region and there would be a ceasefire. But now we hear from the United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and this is what he had to say. Let's watch.
There was no agreement in Alaska. There was a proposal in Alaska, but there was no agreement in Alaska. If there had been an agreement, we would have had an end of the war.
So there we have Marco Rubio saying no agreement. There was a proposal. If there was an agreement, that would be the end of the war. So what do you make of this kind of fundamental misunderstandings between the two sides?
I don't think there's a misunderstanding as such between Moscow and Washington. What I believe is that there is considerable chaos in Washington at present. I do not believe that Donald Trump is in complete control of the American government. For example, the war which he initiated against Iran. Now, I am certainly not making any excuses for Trump, but he is under the influence of some very powerful forces in America. For example, the Israel lobby. So in regard to Ukraine, I do not believe that Trump personally considers Ukraine to be of importance to American national security. However, what he refers to as the deep state, or what I describe as the American ruling elite, certainly do attach a great deal of importance to Ukraine. Why? Because the American ruling elite have been lusting after Ukraine ever since it became independent in December of 1991. Why? In order to complete the encirclement of the Russian Federation on its western borders. Because if you take a map out of Europe, and if you have a look in Eastern Europe from the Baltic states all the way down to the Black Sea, with the exception of Ukraine, you will see that Russia is surrounded by NATO states, also European Union states. And if Ukraine was to ever become a member of NATO, then Russian national security would be faced with a most serious threat, because NATO troops and NATO weaponry, including strategic missiles, would enter Ukraine, and NATO tactical aircraft operating, let's say, from the Kiev Oblast or the Sumy Oblast could reach Moscow within minutes. And the nuclear strategic balance between Russia and America would be disrupted and tilted in favor of America. So that is why the Russians attach no importance to the words coming out of Washington. With the exception of Kherson, the Russian army is advancing along the front from Sumy and Kharkov in the northeast to Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk in the east to Zaporozhye in the south. Russian forces are advancing, albeit slowly. But whatever the cost, even if it means that Russia has to sacrifice millions of its soldiers to capture either all or most of Ukraine, the Russian government and the Russian people as a whole will support that, because of the cultural attachment, significance which is attached by Russians to Ukraine, and because of Ukraine's sheer importance to Russian national security. The Russian mindset in war is vastly different to the Western mindset. As I said moments ago, the Russians are prepared to sacrifice whatever it takes to ensure that the Russian army controls either all or, what I believe, most of Ukraine. And I believe that in time, the Russian army will advance to the oblasts of Zhytomyr and Vinnytsia.
Marcus Papadopoulos, thanks for being with us.
Thank you ever so much.